So good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all around. I see some old but still young faces. Really a pleasure to see you around. I see that you keep the link with the institution. So, I mean, let me start right away. It's the talk that I'm going to give is on the sort of the present state of what has been called the liberal international order, LIO, and what are possible scenarios for its future evolution. And why, what motivated the talk? Well, it's because there was a common sense among analysts and international commentators that the Trump presidency had completely disorganized the state of international relations, the international system. It had put into question several long established certainties, etc. And that, in a sense, Trump himself was sort of deconstructing several elements of this liberal international order. So, I mean, what were some of the notorious actions that he took that certainly went against the pre existing order of international relations? First of all, it was the withdrawal from some international organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, exactly at the same time as the pandemic was raging from UNESCO. We know that the United States has always had a complicated relationship with the UNESCO. It was not the first time that the United States withdrew from UNESCO, but there it was again, withdrawing again, together with Israel, then the Human Rights Council, and finally the WTO, the World Trade Organization, from which the United States did not withdraw, but it did its very best to prevent its proper functioning, first by blocking the naming of new members to the appellate body, and finally, and very dramatically, by withdrawing the consensus for the naming of the new Director General of the organization, which means that right now at present, the organization does not have a direct general. But it was not just from international organizations. There were some very important agreements from which the United States withdrew. First of all, the Paris Agreement of 2015, which, as you all know, is a landmark agreement in the field of international government, climate slash environmental government, and the JCPOA, which was the agreement with Iran. And rather than trying to build consensus and to use diplomacy, he changed completely the style of American foreign relations towards aggressive unilateralism, or rather than privileging multilateralism, going towards bilateralism, or even unilateralism. In the case of the US relationship with China, this was very, very clear, as well as with tariff wars with China. So, what was so paradoxical in this situation was that it's generally considered that it was the United States who was the major actor, the major architect of the international order, which was put in place after World War II, already during World War II, and which was present at the creation of many of these institutions and inspired many of these institutions. It was the very creator, the very architect and promoter of these institutions, of these rules, of this system of international government, who was the first to sabotage it, to sabotage the modus operandi, to sabotage the international organizations, the agreements, etc. And it was during those days that there were lots of alarmists titles saying that, oh my God, the liberal international order is disappearing, it's in crisis, etc. And this you could see in the number of papers and articles, think pieces, op-eds, etc., including by some major thinkers. And so the issue, particularly those most more sympathetic to multilateralism, to consensus building in international relations, is, oh my God, this is the world that we have known so far. What's going to happen next? So then what comes next? It's the Biden presidency. Okay, there was the very dramatic US election with all its share of drama and contestation, etc., etc. But in the end, Biden was elected, and eventually yeah, he had his inauguration. So that's the situation where we are there. And with this, many quote unquote liberals, internationalists, multilateralists, etc., they drew a deep sigh of relief, saying, oh my God, thanks God, now everything is coming back in order because Biden did promise that the US was back to multilateralism and back to world leadership, which is more complicated than being back to multilateralism. But I mean, there was a sense that the world was back to the normal situation. And in fact, some of his first acts went exactly in the direction of withdrawing some of the decisions of the Trump presidency, rejoining international organizations like the WHO. He announced the intention of rejoining the Paris Agreement, etc. In the case of WTO, the American government announced that it was withdrawing its objection to the election of the DG, and so it's probably a matter of days before the next DG of the WTO will be elected. So the organization will have a number one again, etc. But then the question is it possible or desirable to go back to the previous situation? And here I'm talking especially about the situation, not just the working of the institutions, but the power of American leadership in international relations. And more than that, the more fundamental question is was the previous liberal international order up to the task of governing interdependence? Was it up to the task of doing what it had proposed itself to do? So before we start discussing the challenges to the liberal international order, to international governance, etc., let's take a very short step back and recall what is this liberal international order. First of all, you have to recognize that it means different things to different authors. Okay, and so it's a notion which is even though there is a hardcore, I mean, the exact contours of this liberal international order What it includes, what it does not include, this is something that varies considerably according to different authors. Okay, so I mean, one of the main defendants and proponents of the very notion is John Eikenberry, and he is also a staunch defendant of its importance and of its continuing relevance. And he places the origins of the liberal international order way back in the past. And he says that it has a very ambitious project, which is to deal with modernity and the challenges of modernity. And what does he mean by that? Well, he means it's a way of course, of international governance, which deals with the rising importance of science, of technology, but also, and industrialization, everything that goes with it, but also all of the social disruptions that come along with modernity, meaning that it has to deal both of the positive sides of mass employment, rising productivity, rising living standards, etc., but also the dark side of it, which is social tensions, eventually war, imperialism, um, totalitarianism, etc. All of this is part of modernity. So it's really a tall order what this liberal international order proposes itself to deal with. So what are some of the principles which are usually associated? And this is not necessarily related to Eikenberry, but I mean, it's pretty much consensual. It's that it is, and here it's more related to the post-World War II liberal international order. It's related to the hegemony through institutions, hence the importance of institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the specialized agencies, WHO, UNESCO, WIPO, FAO, etc., etc., and hence the central role, which is also given to multilateralism as a way of instituting international governance and regulating and facilitating international relations, and ultimately being a form of governance of globalization itself. It's supposedly based on the rule of law, and according to the more enthusiastic defenders of the liberal international order, democracy, even more than that, liberal democracy is part of this overall pictures. So, and now coming back to Eikenberry, where does he put the origins of this? He says that the liberal international order, they go back to European Enlightenment, to the classical thinkers of Enlightenment, including John Locke, so back to the 17th century in terms of, I mean, the ideological basis, but in terms of practice, according to him, it was built through the collaboration of many heads of state, politicians, diplomats, international negotiators, etc., along the 19th and 20th century. So there have been different avatars of this. Of course, you've got the reconstruction of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna, the European Concert, and then following the other major conflicts, you've got after World War I, the League of Nations, after World War II, the United Nations, etc., etc. And what is interesting is that over 200 years, this was built under Anglo-American hegemony, of course, first under British hegemony, and later under American hegemony. But the point is that this order it was already facing serious challenges even before Trump. So yes, Trump represented a major challenge to this, but doesn't mean that before Trump emerged, everything was working fine. And let's see what were some of the pre-existing challenges to this order, which was built, let's say, if you want to have a long view of it, over 200 years, or if you want to have a shorter view, the order that was established after World War II, but which also makes it pretty long and long-standing because that was already more than 70 years ago. So first of all, there has been the rise of the global south, i.e. the strengthening of the importance of what used to be called the third world of developing countries. And this is something that is well established. Let me just recall you some forms in which this is more than evident. So I mean here, these are a couple of charts which show you the relative importance of what is the so-called the importance of the West. Remember, it's in a conventional sense what is considered as the West. It's North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Whereas what is the global south? Well, it's basically all of Latin America, all of Africa, and all of Asia, except for Japan, and but also Oceania, except for Australia and New Zealand. So I mean, in terms of country, it's a huge group of countries. So I mean, in green you have the so-called West, in red you have the so-called global South. You see that in terms of global GDP, the importance of the global South almost tripled over a period of less than 50 years. It went from 16% of the world total to 40%, and these are 2019 data. When we have the data for 2020, this would be even starker because you know that the so-called Western countries were all in recession in 2020, whereas the Chinese economy continued growing last year. If you look at world exports, you get, in a sense, a similar picture. You see that, I mean, these are merchandise exports. It's a longer time frame, starting from after World War II in 1948, and then the most recent data, which was last year. You see how the importance of the West shrank in terms of international trade from 62% of global exports to just, if I may say so, 47%, whereas the global south emerged from less than 30, less than one third, to getting closer to 50% of world exports. Getting out of the field of economics, if you see in terms of military spending, the rise of the global stock is of the global south is even starker. You can see that starting with 1987, that's the first year for which there are data for the Soviet Union, which of course should not be ignored for that period. But back then in 1987, the global south accounted for just 12% of global military spending, and nowadays is over one third. And in terms of population, because at the end of the day, this also counts. It counts for markets, for workforce, for the future, etc. Particularly in a period like this and the future, where many countries, particularly advanced countries, are getting into demographic decline. You see that the global south has always been, over the last 70 years, the most important group in terms of global population, and this importance has just grown ever since and will continue to do so up to the middle of this century. See, I mean, for population data, you can have long-term projections. So what this also means is that there's not just a a change in economics and in the location of economic activity, of production, of international trade, of capital flows, etc., but also in terms of power relations and the views of these emerging powers on the international order and how it should be governed. So what we have seen is the rise of the so-called revisionist powers who are contesting the liberal international order. Why are they revisionists? Well, basically because they are the so-called emerging powers, which is a little bit of a misleading, a little bit of a misnomer, but never mind. Why are they revisionists? Well, it's quite simply because they are not part of the West. And you have to consider that over the last 200 years, this international order has been dominated by the West. So who are the so-called revisionist powers? First of all, you've got China, very important, but also some other countries like Russia, Iran, North Korea, who is not a world power, but who is certainly contesting, for instance, the international governance on nuclear armaments, etc. And so they have some different views, also in geopolitical terms, of how the world should be governed, and particularly of their own role, of their own place in the world order. And to this, even going beyond these so-called revisionist powers, you have several countries who are dissatisfied with global governance. And what's the problem is that generally their calls, they are unheeded. They continue making calls for changes in international governance, and this goes unheeded. So, for instance, if you take in terms of international trade, after the Uruguay round, after the WTO was established, developing countries started becoming more and more vocal of the treatment that they had in the Uruguay round, in the agreements which established eventually the World Trade Organization. So what was the response of the international community was to launch the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations. Well, too bad that this was launched 20 years ago, the so-called Doha Development Round, and it's gone nowhere. Or, to give you another example, think about the famous P5, the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so Russia, China, United Kingdom, France, United States. Well, who are these countries? Well, they are the victors of World War II, which is fine. But I mean, this was the situation in the 1940s. That was 70 years ago. So nowadays you have this situation in which you have no representation whatsoever as a permanent member of the Security Council of Africa, of Latin America, okay? So all of this to say that you have the emergence, economic, political, etc., even if you want cultural, etc., of several countries which has not been reflected in the governance of the international system. And so, you have other challenges to the world, the liberal international order, in the form of the emergence of global problems, global challenges, which are really global. And to a large extent, they are the far-reaching consequences of globalization. Remember, globalization means increasing integration among countries, among economies, among societies, for better and for worse. But I mean, this also means that many of the problems with which countries and societies have to deal with, these are also global problems and which should be dealt with in a global way. I I mean, of course, something which is unfortunately very fashionable because it's very present is health crisis. I mean, it's true that you have had a very large scale health crisis and pandemics in the past, but never did it spread. So, I mean, you had the Black Plague, you had the Spanish flu, etc., but never did it spread so quickly, or never did it affect every single country of the world, as has been the case with COVID-19. And what the health experts have been warning us about is that COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic, which means it is a global problem requiring global solutions. Are we seeing them? Not at all. What we have seen is particularly nationalist solutions, and in some cases, even countries fighting each other to get PPEs, nowadays to get vaccines, etc. So what we are saying right now is exactly the opposite of what a liberal international order should be. Another global challenge, climate change. Same thing. I mean, discussions have been going on ever since, in a sense, almost the 1970s, certainly the 1980s. And we have seen the ambiguous love-hatred relationship of the United States with international framework to combat climate change. So starting with the UNFCCC, United Framework Convention on Climate Change, later the Paris Agreement. It's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. The fact of the matter is that we are not seeing international, global, coordinated action to combat climate change. Migration. This is another aspect, a crucial aspect of globalization. We have seen international flows intensifying, but what we see is, again, is individual countries trying to deal with this issue individually, and even very, very feeble trials to have some sort of international coordination, as was the case of the International Convention on Migration, which was initiated by the UN. This is something which, and it was very, very mild. Even that gave rise to controversies. And of course, the United States did not join it. Another incredible challenge to states is illicit financial flows, tax evasion. So you have these huge, enormous amounts of capital which are crisscrossing the globe. You have corporate profits which are declared in one jurisdiction, which is completely different from where these profits were generation, just to take advantage of international tax competition between countries, etc. But also you have international illicit financial flows, which affect both developing countries and developed countries. The combined effect of all of this is to reduce the fiscal capacities of all states in the world, both developed and developing. What's the consequence? That with reduced fiscal capacity, the states have less and less capacity to accomplish their function. So this indirectly poses a challenge for multilateralism and international cooperation. Finally, another very important aspect of globalization is increasing inequality, both domestic and international. Domestic, why? Because of basically the economic model which has been around over the last 40 years has favored the concentration of income nationally. That's what you have seen in the vast majority of countries. Talk about United Kingdom, United States, but also China, so both rich and poor countries, but also internationally. And why is this the case? Well, because you see that, yes, there were some countries which have been able to play globalization well and have been capable of raising their GDP, their standards of living, their exports, etc. It's the case of countries like China, like Vietnam, like South Korea, Taiwan, etc. What's the problem? The problem is that these successful countries, they have been the minority of countries, whereas the vast majority of countries, they, in a sense, they have been left behind by globalization. So yes, they are involved with globalization, they are integrated internationally, but in the lower ranks of value chains, etc. It's a case of the vast majority of Latin American countries, with the exception of Mexico. It's the case of the vast majority of African countries, with the possible exception of some North African countries, but even Asia, apart from these East Asian success cases, Southeast Asian success cases, the other Asian countries have not been so successful in playing globalization. And they have other challenges of globalization has been the rising power of non-state actors. Now, if you talk with IR people, political science people, of course, what immediately will come to their mind is terrorist groups, so groups like ISIS, Al Qaeda, etc., etc. But perhaps with an even more far-reaching consequences than the emergence of these non-state armies, terrorist groups, however you want to call them, is the strengthening of the global power of a corporate interest of large multinational enterprises like the GAFAM, so Google, Apple's, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Tesla, etc., which have come to have a huge grip on international data flows, which completely escape the control of citizens, the control of national states, and so, I mean, which poses questions in terms of the free flow of information, of private rights, etc., etc. But also they are very good at evading taxes again, which poses questions for national states and their financing. And finally, another possible consequence of globalization is are we seeing the emergence of a global civil society? This is an open question, but even if this is a trend which does intensify, I mean, there are some initial indications of that, but probably we are not there yet. The point is that even if this does happen, the present structures, the present institutions are not really equipped to deal with them. And finally, coming back to domestic policy, politics, we have the lingering toxic domestic policies. Maybe Trump lost the election, but Trumpism is not dead. Let's not forget that he got 74 million votes. There is a raging battle for the soul of the Republican Party, but I mean, he himself might come back come 2024, or someone from the same ideological orientation. And going outside the United States, you have many other countries, both rich countries, middle income countries, and developing countries as well, where these far-right neo-nationalists, populists continue to be in power. So, of course, by the very fact that they are neo-nationalists, their inclination for international cooperation and for multilateralism is very low. So, all of this to say that the liberal international order was already facing very serious consequences or challenges even before Trump. Of course, Trump contributed a lot to put it into question. So now, what is the outlook for the future? And here I propose some four scenarios which go from ideal to horrible, and two of them are more or less intermediate for us to get thinking about possibility. Of course, I draw a little bit of caricature, but just to emphasize the differences among them. So, what are these four scenarios? The first one would be the strengthening and deepening of multilateralism. The second one would be a neo-nationalist withdrawal. Third one would be regionalization. And the fourth one would be the good old status quo. So let's see how each one of these scenarios would look like. The first one is the strengthening and deepening of multilateralism. That's what some enlightened spirits and leaders have been calling for. This is the title of an article which was published just a couple of weeks ago. But I mean, many of these characters, of these political leaders, they launched not so long ago something which is called the Alliance for Multilateralism. The name of it tells it all. And it was something, yes, it was launched by France and Germany, but it got the adhesion of 60 countries. So it would say, it would point to the direction, yes, multilateralism is not there. Maybe we are going forward. But what's the problem with this? Is that if multilateralism were to deal with all of these realities, the new challenges of globalization, but also the dark side of globalization, the challenges to national states, all of these challenges which go beyond national borders, which require necessarily global, multilateral, international solutions, reforms would need to go much, much deeper than what is presently envisaged now. It would mean incorporating the new power relations, so accommodating the emerging powers, the global south, and particularly the systemically important countries of the global south, one way into the other, or the other into international governance structures, be it the UN, be it the WTO, be it international organizations, but also other security structures, etc. And of course, this is never easy. It would also mean accounting for new social realities. And what is this? It is that many trends, many factors, they go way beyond national borders. It's the case of pandemics, but also it's many social movements. They are connected among themselves, so there would need to be new forms of governance to deal with this. Of course, there would be need to be for a much stronger governance in on the themes of health, of the environment. Health, we have seen how the existing structures have by and large not been adequate to deal with the present pandemic. So will it be any better for the next one? It's not sure. If things are left the way they are now, the world will not be prepared for the next one. And we have the unfolding environmental crisis. I mean, the progress which have done so far, they are not satisfactory, but we need to recognize that there have been some commitments towards carbon neutrality by systemically important players, which are the European Union, the United States, and China. Of course, the question is whether these pledges will be implemented. You would also need to have cooperation on taxation, but also on effective ways to combat in international illicit flows, because it's quite often it's said that, well, but I mean these monies, they are fleeing corrupt regimes in the third world, and in many cases this is true, but they are going somewhere, they are arriving somewhere. So, I mean, these flows, they're always from one place to the other, from one country to the other. Hence, the need for international cooperation would need to see this. And if you take the reasoning to its limit, it would imply changing the forms of sovereignty. And here, that's where the going gets really tough because, as we all know, sovereignty is seen still nowadays, no matter what the context of international globalization we live in, as the fundamental preserve of national states. And the one feature of national states, of still Westphalian states, which they are not ready to give in. So, but still, I mean, this is a very, very challenging scenario, but in a sense, this is the ideal scenario. It would be a victory of international cooperation, which takes into account the new dynamics of globalization and the new realities of global societies, but also of the global economies. Now let's see the complete opposite scenario, which is the neo-nationalist withdrawal, meaning that all countries in the world, or the most important countries in the world, in a sense, they would go the Trumpian way. Neo-nationalists, they stay in power for a long time, and there is an even further weakening of multilateral cooperation. So this could be possibly be driven by identity politics, which again is very toxic. It leads to divisions, to conflict internally. So this probably could lead to increase in intra-national conflicts, intrastate conflicts, but could also go beyond borders. It could go to interstate conflicts. I mean, in such a context, of course, there would be very little, if any, cooperation on this quintessentially global challenge, which is the environment, which is climate change. So, I mean, which means that all the negative trends that we are seeing right now, they only would get worse, and this would have very serious social and political consequences. So this would lead to increased international migration. I mean, there are projections which say that there are some parts of the earth which will be unlivable by 2015 because it will simply too hot for the human body to continue living there, and this could lead to the migration of hundreds of millions of people. So if you think about how migration is contentious nowadays, when you have some thousands of people who are migrating, just imagine what would be the case if this were multiplied by thousands. So this would be a scenario which reminds us of the realist theory in international relation, in which you have really a Hobbesian world, a war of all states against all states. So this is a worst case scenario. So let me now draw two other scenarios, which are somewhere in between, not the full victory of multilateralism and full cooperation, not this war of all against all. One other scenario would be the scenario of regionalization, which would mean that the world economy would reorganize around the three ecosystems, three systems of supply chains and international trade, hovering around these three poles, these three economic heavyweights, which are East Asia, North America, and the European Union. In some sense, to a certain extent, you already have this. So, I mean, of course, European Union is the most advanced form of economic integration, but it might become more important because post-pandemic, there is some tendency towards reshoring of activity towards industrialized countries, because countries have seen the dangers of international supply disruptions, as we have seen because of COVID. And so there is going to be some degree of reshoring. In the case of the United States, Biden will continue one way or the other this pressure on American business to reshore part of their manufacturing activities towards the United States. But also, it's not just a question of where production takes place, but all the standards, the rules that go along with it. And for instance, it's well known that the EU is not a major international geopolitical player, but in terms of regulations, it is an important player. And it is said that there is some sort, some authors argue that there is some sort of a Brussels hegemony in terms of rule setting. So, I mean, the European rules in terms of privacy are a prime example in the sense, which have had worldwide impact. Or if we go towards East Asia, it's not just China. We know that very recently we have had the signing of RCEP, the Regional Common Economic Partnership, if I'm not mistaken, which is a free trade agreement, but also it goes beyond free trade among the 10 Southeast Asian countries of ASEAN, plus China, plus Japan, plus Australia, plus New Zealand. So they have put together something which is the largest trade bloc in the world. So, I mean, this is one possible scenario, which leaves one big question: is where does this leave this where does this scenario leave Latin America and Africa? Well, in Latin America, there's not much happening these days in terms of international integration or international relations. But in Africa, yes, you have had just the beginning of the operation of the African continental free trade area. So, I mean, if it is successful, maybe that Africa as a whole may constitute another pole of economic and political power in this world. And what is another scenario finally? Well, it's simply the status quo in which you have multilateralism limping on. I mean, it is backed by the EU, which is the strongest backer of multilateralism, but also to a certain extent by the US and China, particularly when it suits them, but it's being ignored when it doesn't suit either the United States or China. That's more or less what you have at present. You could have some action on climate change. As I said, there have been these pledges by US, EU, China. Again, everything it remains to be seen to what extent this is actually implemented. You have some marginal reforms in the WTO, in the UN, in other international institutions, but which fall way beyond the first scenario of going really towards a very, very strengthened multilateralism. But the challenges, they will remain there. Remember, just like it was not Trump who invented the crisis or the challenges of the liberal international order, they pre-existed. And many of these challenges about which I spoke earlier, they are still there. So if the international communities decides to push on more or less on the same patterns, etc., what will be the consequence? Well, is that we will be storing crisis for the future, because these major challenges of climate change, of environmental challenges overall, of the excessive power of huge corporations, of the governance of data, of the governance of big business, the issue of pandemics, etc., this will remain there, which means we would be storing crisis for the future. And so I think I will stop here. And if there are questions or remarks, and I'll be more than happy to discuss.